Hi and welcome to All American Atlas, where we deep dive into all the wonderful, weird, and fascinating things that make up the USA. In today's video, we're deep diving into the Pledge of Allegiance to learn more about how this PR gimmick turned national pledge has found its place in American history in schools and sports games and plenty of other locations on a daily basis. If you're American, the Pledge of Allegiance is fully ingrained in your brain. It's impossible to forget, as you probably grew up saying it every single morning in school, hand over heart, facing the flag. It goes, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." But why do we say it? Who came up with it? What's the behind-the-scenes story? Let's start with the history of the pledge. The things that you might not know. So the first idea of any type of vow to the American flag came in 1885. A veteran of the Civil War, George Balch, came up with a version that went, "We give our heads and our hearts to God and our country, one language, one flag." Now, a few schools took this on board and were like, "Okay, George, good idea, let's adopt this pledge." But generally, he isn't considered the true father of the Pledge of Allegiance. That honor would go to a man named Francis Bellamy. Bellamy was a former Baptist minister, and in 1892, he was working for a magazine that was called Youth's Companion. Youth's Companion, a little bit hard to say, was the country's largest magazine at the time, and Francis and his marketing companions at the magazine had come up with a grand idea to do a big PR push where US flags would be given to readers who sold subscriptions, and then, in 1892, on the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus showing on up to the New World, the flag would be raised over every public school and saluted with an oath. Now, it's important to remember the context of the history of the pledge, because it came about during a period of immigration to the US of over 2 million Southern and Eastern European immigrants. They were seen, according to Bellamy, as races which we cannot assimilate without a lowering of our racial standard. There was a panic at the time within the US, born out of xenophobia, that the true America would fall by the wayside unless a national identity was established. The new flood of immigrants were also more likely to be Catholic or Jews than Protestant, which at the time seemed almost anti-American to many people. This is part of the darker side of the history of the pledge. So, Bellamy, at a time of American nationalism and a fear of this new wave of immigration, sets out to create this pledge to use in the patriotic celebrations that would take place across the country. Of course, don't forget, this is also an effort to sell the magazine. It's as much a commercial endeavor as it was a personal one. In fact, the reason they were giving away flags was because they had simply ordered too many. Now, the very first version of the pledge went, "I pledge allegiance to my flag and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." Interestingly, "under God" was not added until 1954, which we'll get to in a minute. But before we continue on with how the pledge evolved over time, here's where the drama really starts. It was considered for many years that Francis Bellamy was the author of the Pledge of Allegiance, until 2022, yes, just 2 years ago, when a historian came across a newspaper from May 21st of 1892. This was 3 months before Francis Bellamy's pledge would be released. In this newspaper, high school students recited a pledge that sounded almost exactly the same. And this pledge that the high school students recited actually came from the year 1890, when a schoolboy who was 13 years old and named Frank E. Bellamy submitted it to a contest. Over the years, it has been certified by many institutions, including the Library of Congress in 1957, that Francis Bellamy, the man, not the 13-year-old, wrote the pledge. But historians are currently grappling with this new information and wondering how it plays into the overall timeline. Francis Bellamy has sworn multiple times under oath that he did in fact write the Pledge of Allegiance. But could he have been inspired by the wording used by the schoolboy Frank Bellamy? Was Frank Bellamy the schoolboy inspired by something else? No written record has proven that anyone besides Francis Bellamy wrote the pledge, but it does raise a lot of questions. Now, over the years, the pledge seemed to gain popularity across public schools in the US, though it did continue to undergo some changes. In the 1920s, the National Flag Conference changed the words to include "to the flag of the United States of America." This was done to erase any confusion for new immigrants, as the original pledge didn't actually state anything about the US and just said, "to my flag." They wanted to make it abundantly clear whose flag we were talking about here. Other changes included a very important one in 1942. Congress officially adopts the pledge, but realized that the way of saying the pledge at the time, which was using something called the Bellamy salute, very much resembled the Nazi salute, and obviously this was a horrible idea, so they changed it to your hand over your heart. The final major change came in 1954 during the Cold War by President Eisenhower, when "under God" was added. Why? It was important at the time for many Americans to separate the US from the atheism of the Soviet Union. Now, who has to say the pledge? Whether you're American or you're watching this from the outside looking in, you've probably heard of various modern controversies over who has to say the pledge. Is it an actual requirement? What will happen if you don't? Officially, 47 states in the US require that the pledge be recited in public schools. Only Wyoming, Vermont, and Hawaii do not, and by do not, I mean do not require it officially. Most schools within these states will still say the pledge each morning. However, the Supreme Court resolved in West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett that you cannot be forced to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. That doesn't mean, however, that schools can't still require it as long as they allow exemptions. And varying states have a variety of ways that a student can become exempt. This ranges from written notice from a parent or guardian in states like Florida or Texas to simply being able to maintain a respectful silence if the student does not wish to say the pledge in the state of Washington. And obviously, within classrooms, teachers will have their own way of dealing with this. Now let's finish with criticisms of the pledge, because we can't deny that there have been criticisms of the American Pledge of Allegiance by both those outside the US and those within. On a world stage, the pledge can seem dystopian or something like out of a brainwashing exercise. Comments like, "that sounds like something North Koreans would force upon their people," are not uncommon. And even within conversations online about American teachers saying the pledge with their students, you can find comments that say things like, "I stand and face the flag and think to myself, this is weird." There have also been battles on the incorporation of "under God" into the pledge, with cases being brought up in which this has been challenged. There is a separation of church and state within the US, and so for many, it doesn't make sense to include "under God" in a national pledge. However, cases with this reasoning have been refused based on the idea that ultimately this is a patriotic exercise that just happens to have "under God" in the words, not a religious one. In 2010, the Ninth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals found that the pledge did not represent a government endorsement of religion, and thus it still stands as it is. But of course, for many, despite these criticisms, the Pledge of Allegiance is still an important part of daily life in American schools, and it evokes feelings of pride and love for your country. It is said in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, and is still deeply ingrained in American culture, customs, and tradition. That brings us to the end of today's deep dive. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.